But realistically, my plan really is to just present what I'd like to present for about a half an hour, 30 minutes, 35 minutes. And then we'll have a break and then have another perhaps 30 minutes or so, depending on how you are and how I am. And the other thing that amazes me is that you guys come out on a Sunday night, like Catholics would be in bed or they would be watching TV tonight, but you know, you guys are out, so it's an amazing thing. In fact, it's amazing that I'm out too. Anyway, so that's the plan for tonight. You would know this, wouldn't you? And this, when I saw this scene, it really touched me deeply. This young lad called Alan, 3-year-old lad, and his brother Galip. And as you know, both of them drowned, along with a mother, and 7 other people in this, or 12 other people in this boat, as they were seeking to find a place of refuge. They were going to the island of Kos, and then they drowned, and his body of that beautiful little boy ended up on the beach of Bodrum in Turkey, on the western part of the Turkish coast. So what I was thinking of when I began thinking about tonight and tomorrow is I couldn't speak without thinking about what's happening in our world today. As you know, 60 million people have been displaced by what's happening in Syria, which I've visited twice in the time that I take people to the Middle East. And some of these places I know very well. I know some of the people there. So 60 million people have been displaced. That's almost 3 times the population of Australia. It's extraordinary. And we know what's happening, of course, in the movement that's happening in Europe and the interchange that's happening between Germany and the rest of the European Union, France and Hungary and so on. The invitation to accept these people. And there's been a movement within even our own Australian government. You know, 12,000 people are going to be from Syria. My suspicion is they're going to be, the tendency is they're going to cherry pick only the Christians. And I think, I'm hoping that there's going to be a whole movement against that. So there's that I've been aware of. And the other thing has been this, you would have heard of the floods in Japan, where 100,000 people have been displaced as well. And this has only happened in the last week. So, how do we put this up against us here today and the gospel that I would like to look at, which is the Gospel of Luke? And if we don't connect this to the gospel, then everything remains isolated and disconnected from the world in which we live. Because I think what's happened to Aileen, and what's happened in Japan, and what's happening around our world are interconnected. So that's what I'm coming out of, and very much aware of this. So what I'd like to do in the 10 hours available to me tonight is to look at what I call the frame of Luke's Gospel, particularly the temple. Now, if I was doing this with a Roman Catholic mob, I'd have to explain what the Bible is. And then all that sort of stuff. But because I feel in familiar territory, I don't have to explain a lot of this. However, what I want to do in the time tonight is to look at what I think is the frame in Luke's Gospel, and that there are 2 pieces that I want to look at. One is the temple. The temple frames the gospel. It begins after the prologue, the first four verses of the gospel. Then we have the scene of Zechariah in the temple. And then after that, in the temple where the whole story begins, is the Annunciation of the birth of John the Baptist. Excuse me. And then it moves to the Annunciation of the birth of Jesus. Then the whole story unfolds. And then right at the end, in the last chapter, Luke 24, so we have the story of Jesus' resurrection. We have the two on the road to Emmaus. We have Jesus gathering with his disciples in the room and eating fish with them. And then finally, on the day of Easter, they go out to Bethany, and he's ascended. And what do? They go back to the temple. So the temple is the frame of Luke's gospel. And the other frame is what I'm calling rock and cloth. Because as we move into the story of Luke, after we get over the Annunciation scenes, the meeting of the two mothers, and then the story of Jesus' birth, which we all know so well. Everyone knows the story of Jesus' birth very well. We're told how Mary takes the child, wraps him in bands of cloth, and lays him in a manger. We know this. And then we're told after that, the shepherds are out in the fields and they have this encounter with the heavenly chorus, and they're told about a sign, and this is the sign. You will find a babe wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger. Okay. Now, if you were listening to this story, you'd have to say cloth and the manger are pretty important. In fact, it's a sign. Okay. So I'm going to suggest that the manger has got something to do with rock. The only mangers we know of that have been archaeologically identified are rock mangers. Okay, so we've got cloth and rock. And then we go to the end of Luke's Gospel, and you have Joseph of Arimathea taking the body of Jesus and wrapping the body in cloth. The Greek is sindon, which is linen, a linen cloth, and then placing the body in a rock-hewn tomb. Got it? So you can see how the temple, and then it's like peeling back the layers of an onion. You've got the outer layer, which is the temple, and then you've got the inner layer, which is this rock and cloth. So I want to explore with you just a little bit more about that. And then I between the cloth and the rock, I want to look at some of what I call the ecological suggestions that come out of Luke's Gospel. And it so happens I like pigs. Okay, so I'm going to redeem the pigs tonight. And I also want to look at other animals as well, but mainly pigs. But I've got birds there, but I'm not going to deal with birds tonight. I'm going to deal with birds tomorrow. And I want to look at a few other scenes, particularly water. Now, I'm doing this because I begin from the premise that we're so used to hearing the gospel anthropocentrically. In other words, the story, so when I go to church and you go to church, and the preacher, unless of course it's some of these characters here that you know so well, they would be very sensitive to this. But Generally, and this happens in my own tradition, generally the story is about Jesus and about the redemption of human beings. So there's an anthropocentrism that dominates our preaching in our church, in my church, and I suspect it could happen in your church. Now, I don't know what gospel you had today. The one we had universally around... See, the thing is that you guys have is that you're very flexible, whereas we're very rigid. And I can tell you what happened in Rome today in the Pope's liturgy, because that's how we do it. And the central gospel today from Mark's gospel was the story of Jesus in Mark 8 saying, "Who do people say I am?" Did you have that?
We did.
Yeah. And probably if you heard the preaching, it would have been about Jesus and us, right? Sorry, not at Berry. Okay.
He was preaching very good. I was at Barnabas.
Okay, so what did you preach about?
Basically the prophets, reading it, the way of wisdom.
Oh, okay. And
He's
you?
a renegade. Oh no, I wasn't preaching. I was listening. But
Okay.
we had the mark.
All right. And the Mark reading is about, it's Christological, who is Jesus? So we're used to, I think, the principal focus in our preaching has been anthropocentric. It's all about human beings and human salvation. However, with the kind of work that we've been doing in Adelaide, and Peter's been a major contributor to this, and I've helped put him on the right path too, we've developed a project called the Earth Bible Project, and you would have had Norm Harble here today, who's the... Sorry? At Christchurch, yeah. I mean, Norm's the great-grandfather of the Earth Bible Project. Peter and I have told him everything he should be thinking about it. Isn't that right, Peter? So that's kind of developed. But it's a major project that's having international impact. I don't know if you realise it, but it is. And a lot of us are doing work trying to reclaim the ecological reverberations that are present in the text. And I want to say that because, and the work I'm particularly interested in is in Luke's Gospel. I say that not because I think Luke was an ecologist. Luke was not an ecologist. But I think the world of Luke and the kind of people that Luke talks about are people who were steeped in the natural world. And so they were ecologically sensitive, if I can use that language. They were sensitive to the world in which they live. Tomorrow, what I want to do is what I want to do tomorrow is give you a social snapshot of the audience that I believe Luke was talking to. And it's not just one specific group. I think it's a range of people who have various relationships to the earth in which they live. And so the first part of tomorrow is to look at that kind of social snapshot. So I come to this aware that it's possible to bring my ecological resonances, my concern about the world into dialogue with a text that comes out of the first century. It's a legitimate way of trying to understand how the text might freshly speak into the world in which I live. I've just got a quote here from Pope Francis. He says, and you would have come across an encyclical letter which he wrote to the Universal Catholic community, but included the letter to all people. He says, the contemplation of creation allows us to discover in each thing a teaching which God wishes to hand on to us. Since for the believer, to contemplate creation is to hear a message, to listen to a paradoxical and silent voice. To contemplate creation is to hear a message to listen to a paradoxical and silent voice. Now, I think that voice has been silent in Scripture. And this is the thing that Norm would have been saying today at the other place. I think, was that right? There's an exam, by the way, at the end of tonight, and you won't be getting out unless you get the right answers, okay? 6 a.m, that's right. So what I've been, so a lot of us involved in this Earth Bible project have been trying to allow that silent voice that's within the text to come forward. So that's what I'm doing. And I want to say too that as we do this, there are ecological resonances that we don't normally attend to that I want to actually do tonight. So that's my plan, is to have a look at the temple, beginning and end, to have a look at the stone and the cloth, and then in the middle, which is chapters 4 to 18, which we won't do tonight, all of it, we'll do a few things, time permitting. Okay. So does that make sense? Okay? You know where I'm going? And the thing that's happened within me is I cannot now not hear the gospel ecologically. It's amazing, actually. It becomes, once you attune yourself to it, it's amazing what happens. Okay. So let me talk about the temple. So you know the temple is the beginning of the gospel and at the end of the gospel, and I think it's a frame. Now, by the time Luke writes, the temple no longer exists. Luke, I think, is writing towards the end of the first century, around the 80s of the first century, writing in a Greco-Roman world and writing to people who have a memory. The temple is still in living memory, even though it was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. So it's still part of the heritage that Luke's audience would be aware of, particularly those who come out of a Jewish context. Okay, so they'd know this. They would know what the temple was like, and it would be like, for example, for us, if the whole barrier reef, the whole barrier, what I'm trying to talk about, what's the barrier? The Great Barrier Reef was destroyed, right? We would know what it meant after its destruction. We would have the memory still lingering with us. And I think the same applies to Luke's Gospel and the memory of the temple. And this was the quintessential ecological image. It was the quintessential ecological memory. It was the temple was the nexus between heaven and earth. It was the bond between heaven and earth. It was the navel, as it were, between heaven and earth. So there were all these ecological images that surrounded the temple. So, for example, and Peter, I'm just so aware you'd know more about this than I would, and you'll correct me afterwards, I know. But so the whole panelling that so the Holy of Holies, which is right here, was surrounded. First of all, the entrance into it was surrounded by this panelling, which had all these beautiful natural images that we can see there, the ferns and all these beautiful trees and so on. Then there was this panelling, the curtain which led the person into the Holy of Holies. We know too that the priests that went in once a year into the sanctuary of God's presence, we know the person had their leg tied with a rope when they went in, because if something happened to them, no one could go in, but they could pull this guy out. You know, it's an amazing kind of thing. How holy this is the place of God's holiness, and yet when you think of it, this was surrounded by all these wonderful earth images. So the whole structure surrounding it was this stuff here, and then we had these columns which represented growth, and these, sorry, just going back a bit, and this right towards the edge of the forecourt was this great basin that contained all this water, and it was called the sea. Now I'm thinking, isn't that interesting? All this, and when I think of the sea and think of water, water is the primary substance of the universe in the ancient world. It's the primary substance of creation. So in the story of creation, there's water, everything's watery, and then water has to be put into vaults, the water above, the water beneath, and the water beneath has to be separated to create dry land, etc., etc. I mean, you know the story. So here we have this water, this watery substance. So this is a whole ecological symbol, fruitful, everything's fruitful, and it's saying something about the fruitfulness of God's life that comes to the people of Israel. It's into this setting that the gospel begins, with Zechariah going into the temple to offer sacrifice. And as we know, he's very old, and he prays, and he has this experience of God, and he's struck dumb. Isn't that amazing? Encountering God in the holy place, and he's struck dumb. So, and the animals, the bulls, yeah, the base, pointing to the 4 points of the compass. So it's kind of this universal symbol. Everything bonded together. So this is where the gospel begins. It's where the gospel ends. Because in the last verses of the gospel, on the day of Ascension, so if you've got your Bibles, you know, you may like to read. I can't say this in a Roman Catholic situation because they never bring them, you know what I mean? Sorry? Oh, good on you. I'm glad she did. Okay. So, on the day of Easter, the day of the resurrection, chapter 24, verse 50, then Jesus led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. And they returned to Jerusalem with great joy and were continually in the temple blessing God. Okay? So that's where it ends. So let me just move to the next little stage, which is after the story with Zechariah, which I could go into in detail, but I won't. Then we have the meeting of the two mothers. Two mothers who are pregnant, and this is a whole gathering, an encounter with utter fertility. Now, if that's not a creation image or an earth image, I don't know what is. So then we have the story after the birth of John, the story of Jesus' birth. So we're told that Mary wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger. And then we have the other story later where the shepherds then encounter the angel who says, "This will be a sign for you. You will find a child wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger." So what's the sign? So the angel says to the shepherds, "This is the sign. You'll find a child wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger." Now, cloth in the ancient world is not polyester. If I actually looked at the tags at the backs of most of your clothing, which I won't, but, you know, we have often polyester or natural and unnatural products. No? Only cotton. Okay, here's the cotton class.
So I have a Jewish grandfather.
Do you? I have a Jewish great-grandfather. Yeah, there we go. But, you know, unnatural products are very popular today. In the ancient world, cloth was always natural. natural fabrics. And so cloth is part of it, and the other image that's connected to cloth is linen. Linen in the ancient world is made from flax, and it was considered to be eternal as distinct from wool. Wool came from sheep, and was mortal. Sheep died, whereas flax was eternal. So anytime you hear the word, and it doesn't come up here in the birth story, but it does come up at the end of the gospel when Jesus is wrapped in a sindon, which is a linen shroud. If Luke is thinking of linen as the cloth that Mary wraps Jesus in, then surrounding this child with linen is surrounding this child with eternity and a product of the earth, a gift of the earth. So what's the sign? Part of the sign is, of course, identifying who Jesus is. And it's not an angel. So the angel doesn't say, this is the sign, we're telling you who Jesus is. The sign is those two elements that surround Jesus. The first is the linen cloth, or the cloth. And the second is lying in a manger. This is the sign. Now, conventional commentaries will tell you that manger is a food trough, right? So therefore, the sign is of Jesus is going to be food for the world. He's going to have communion with earth's animals. And if you trace Jesus' career in Luke's gospel, he's always eating. Okay? Great eater. By the time he gets to the end of the gospel, you need to go on a diet with Jesus. In fact, food is so important in the gospel. And this is only in Luke's gospel when Jesus says to the criminal, says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. This is only in Luke's gospel. Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. Now that promise of paradise is a promise about food. So food is, of course, a gift of the earth. We can't pull it. We can't pull food from anything else but the earth, unless, of course, it's fabricated food, which, of course, is not food; it's something else. So this lying in a manger then is these two elements, cloth and stone, say something about Jesus. And what I'm suggesting is that Jesus is the child of earth. That, I think, is the primary theology that comes out of the birth story of Jesus. He's child of the earth. He's connected to earth. And that's so important. To the point that, and I want to come back to this connection to earth. If I've got this earth connectivity, then how does that shape the way I hear the rest of the gospel? If Jesus is connected to the earth, then how does that get demonstrated in other parts of the gospel? Now, I know tonight our time is limited. I know tomorrow I want to explore over 3 sessions some other elements of the story of Jesus in Luke's gospel ecologically. I'm suggesting we have a break. But what I want to come back to are 3 stories: the storm on the lake, the healing of the human being at Gerasa, and the restoration of one lost son in Luke 15, which is often called the prodigal son, you know? It's not about the prodigal son, but I want to come back to that and say a bit more about it. Is that okay? So it's 20 to 8, so shall we come back about 5 to 8?